Babel by Rf Kuang is probably the most anticipated and biggest fantasy book of 2022. One can even call it the biggest release of 2022. Every booktoker, book blogger, book reviewer, anyone that you follow, anyone that has anything to do with the book community has probably filled up your For You page, your feed, etc. with raging 5-star reviews of Babel. But there are a few things that these reviews are not touching on, which raises the question, is Babel by Rf Kuang really the breath of fresh air that people make it out to be? Or is it frankly overrated? My name is Rupkata Bhattacharjee and you're watching my channel, which is named after me because I lack creativity, and I'm here to tell you exactly that. Is Babel really good or is it overrated? In my opinion, Babel is both and neither at the same time. Babel is a book that is driven by immense passion and ambition, but ultimately fails to deliver at multiple points. We'll start with some of the things that Babel does well, and foremost, its synopsis. Babel, or The Necessity of Violence, an arcane history of the Oxford Translators' Revolution. Yes, I memorized the entire title. By Rf Kuang, centers around a young orphan boy from China named Robin Swift. Robin Swift is plucked from his hometown of Canton by Professor Lovell, a professor tenured at Oxford, who works at the prestigious Institute of Translation, also known as Babel. Now, when in London, Robin Swift is trained in the languages of Greek, Latin, and of course his mother tongues, Cantonese and Mandarin, and is given the ideal that he will be, just like his adoptive father, working at the prestigious Babel, learning the secrets behind silverworking. Now, what is silverworking? Silverworking is a type of magic that is specific to this 1836 alternate version of London that Kuang has cooked up. Silverworking is some sort of alchemy that works not with using chemicals but by using languages. Languages that the Britishers have deemed to be Oriental, like Mandarin, Cantonese, Arabic, Urdu, Hindi, and Bengali. These languages and specific words belonging to these languages are translated back into English and engraved into bars of silver, which are then used to do simple things like making the carriage run smoothly, powering the gas, making the water boil at the perfect temperature, but also to do complex things like power Britain's expansionist policies and help it in exploitation of the global East. Some things that Babel does well is its prose. This book is so well written that one could read this book for it. Kuang has reached this level of craftsmanship, which is only possible after practicing for years and years. It is palpable that Kuang has really put effort in her writing style, because the difference from her writing style in her debut novels, the Poppy War trilogy, and in Babel is very evident. Her prose is a perfect blend between poetic and clinical. Of course, it has areas which are filled with purple prose, which romanticize the setting of the novel itself, but there are also areas that are not sugar-coated, where the prose hits home perfectly and drives the nail home. But aside from the prose, there are a few areas of Babel that are not well done at all. Let us talk about the research. Now, if you have been following Babel's news, if you have been a fan of Kuang before, you might have noticed Kuang boasting about the amount of research that she has done for this book, which is true. Kuang has really captured the essence of 1836 London. She has managed to perfectly captivate the geopolitics of the world at that moment. She has perfectly captured London, or Britain, at its peak in 1836, when Britain's expansionist and colonialist policies are thriving. All of this said, there are some areas which reek of underdevelopment. Like, a word that is used in this book that stands out to me is feminist. There are a few lines where the word feminist is used, and let me explain to you why this speaks to me of lack of research in such a simple thing. The term feminism was coined in 1837, which is 1 year after this book is set, and the word feminist was first used in the 1900s and not in the 1800s at all. So a character who lives between 1836 to the corresponding years later will not be able to use such a term simply because it does not exist at that point. It is very weird to me that a book that talks about linguistics, a book that talks about the beauty of languages, uses such a word in the time context that it is being set. It says to me that some areas were clearly not given much attention to, and this thing should have been caught by at least Kuang's editor, but it was not. Now, you might say I'm being a bit nitpicky about picking a certain word and saying that this one may ruin the experience for me, but as someone who likes to be critical about her reading as much as I can, I was pretty disappointed to see such a flaw in the writing. Another thing is the lack of creativity. Now, again, I am not one to judge because I'm not a creative person myself, but as Kuang, who is a Hugo nominee, a critically acclaimed author, I would expect a bit more creativity from her side. Now, why does Babel lack creativity? It lacks creativity because for a book set in an alternate universe and a book that is marketed with its main genre being fantasy, it is very little of either of those things. One of the major questions that were in my head the entire time was that if London in 1836 truly had magic, how different would it be from our London, the one that we know right now? The answer would be vastly different, but for Kuang, the answer seems more or less the same. Some things that stood out to me were how Kuang really did not go out and define the boundaries of the world that existed in Babel. There was no exposure to the world, there was no proper world building, and no concrete rules to define the magic system that Kuang was writing with. Silver working is given a very broad definition. There are 2 or 3 chapters which define what silver working is, but all of them seem underdeveloped and not fully explored. One of the things that also stands out to me, which is a phrase I'm using a lot in this video, is how Kuang uses excerpts, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, from different poems and different stories that were written before or during the timeline of Babel. One of the ones most prominent was Jerusalem by William Blake. Now, to quote William Blake from his poem Jerusalem, it says dark satanic mills. These 3 words have been used. Now, this is obviously a response to the Industrial Revolution and the workers' revolution that was going on during 1836, because London was obviously at its peak of industrialization. Now, one thing that really speaks to me is that would William Blake write the same poem if London had magic? Would authors still write the same books critiquing the same social standards if that world had magic? If the rich were really heating up their food by using silver working? If even the carriages on the road worked perfectly because silver lined their wheels? Or do they really not know about the truth behind silver working? Multiple questions were raised not only by myself but many readers alike, then how does silver working actually work? But no answers were given by Kuang, and it feels to me that not much thought was given to these areas at all, which is a bit concerning since this book is supposed to be the best fantasy book of 2022. Moving on, another thing that I absolutely disliked was underdeveloped characters. Kuang's characters had motivations, sure, but none of them were fully explored. None of her characters stood out to be 3-dimensional because Kuang blatantly disregards the golden rule of writing: show, don't tell. Kuang prefers telling us about her characters' so-called found family. She prefers telling us about their bonding, but there are no scenes in the book except for 1 or 2 rare circumstances that actually show us how these characters bonded. They actually show us Robin Swift's inner turmoil when he learns that Britain is going to war with China. We are given very few circumstances when we really feel that we are inside the character's head. But apart from that, most of the story is Kuang telling us about what we are supposed to think, which is quite annoying to me because as someone who has read a lot of books, I feel that a writer's voice should not be discernible when they are writing. A writer's voice should be subtle, and Kuang fails to do exactly that. Moving on, let us talk about the elephant in the room, which is Kuang's subtlety. The thing about Rf Kuang is that she doesn't understand the meaning of being subtle. She likes to force down her points through the reader's throat, which was not very noticeable in her original trilogy, The Poppy War, because of the unreliable narrator of the story. But in a book like Babel, where a narrator is one that we could trust possibly, Rf Kuang's voice is ever present. She wants to teach us about colonialism, imperialism, but she always believes that the reader reading this book is there to argue with her. It's funny at times because characters randomly break out into huge monologues about how what Britain is doing is bad and teach the reader like a baby, and phone speeds the reader concepts that possibly everyone reading Babel should know, such as colonialism, expansionism, and imperialism, and even the politics of the United Kingdom. At the beginning, it's passionate, of course. It feels good to read about something that an author has clearly put their entire heart and soul into. But after 2 or 3 monologues, the entire rants about imperialism means this, London is colonizing this place, this is bad, this should be stopped, why aren't you helping us, Robin, gets very annoying. And it feels a bit undermining. Overall, Kuang's lack of subtlety is what makes this book frankly a bit on the nose, because silver working is meant to be a metaphor for London's colonialism. I'm saying London, but that's actually wrong. I would like to replace that with UK's colonialism, or more likely England's colonialism. But the metaphor fails at every other turn because Kuang really doesn't know what a metaphor means, and she insists on explaining her metaphor by being quite direct about it. Other things that were again very irritating to read about was how Kuang remarkably failed to pace her book. Sometimes the book was going quite fast, and other times it was so droll that even I, who is a die-hard Kuang fan, wanted to DNF it, which means leave it unfinished. The book is divided into, or Babel is divided into 5 separate books. Book 1, Book 2, Book 3, Book 4, and Book 5. Book 5 is the climax, which was well paced in my opinion. It was fast, it was smooth like a climax should be. The worst parts were Book 2 and 3, which were incredibly slow, and it would be understandable if Kuang was setting something up, but she was not. The chapters were more or less filler chapters, or they just again contained huge monologues about how imperialism is bad, or the monologues could be about the beauty of language, etc. I believe if the pacing was a bit well done, or if Babel was divided into a duology instead of being one single book, Kuang would have managed it way better. But since she did not, I as a reviewer in good faith could not rate it higher than 3 stars. Moving on to my next point is the politics of Babel. By this I do not mean the entire theme of the book, but more likely how the characters behave with each other, with keeping their political backgrounds in mind. Now, the politics of Babel is heavily borrowed from 2022 Twitter or 2022 world itself. Some of the things that the characters do, some of the things that the characters say really feel like something that a person living in 1836 would not do. Like using the term brown man in racial solidarity when that term did not exist in a positive context at that time. Another thing that stood out to me about this book, which is again, why am I using that phrase so many times, is how formulaic, if that's even a word, Babel is. It feels like Kuang just took her first drafts of the Poppy War and rewrote them in a different setting to make Babel. If you are someone who has previously read the Poppy War, who has enjoyed the Poppy War, look no further for fanfiction, because Babel at some point feels exactly like Poppy War fanfiction, set in a different region, set in a different era, but more or less with the same themes. Babel has some of this very same character arcs, borrows some of the same plot lines, and is overall very predictable for someone who has previously read the Poppy War, which would more or less define 80% of Babel's reader base. Kuang, being an author with a very popular trilogy, is seeing a huge number of returning readers to read Babel. And I mean, if Kuang had showed some more creativity in thinking about new plot lines, about setting up different character arcs, I would definitely say that it was different from the Poppy War. But as someone who has read both the Poppy War and Babel, it feels to me very similar, which is okay for an author who is obviously copying from her previous book. And again, the word copying is used for the lack of a better term. but at times I was hoping for something new, and this just felt like reading a poorer version of the Poppy War. More or less, this was a 3 stars for me. I would not say that I did not enjoy reading Babel. I definitely enjoyed reading it. I cried while reading it. I got attached to the characters. It was entertaining. I finished it in 2 days. I get what Kuang was trying to say. I appreciate her understanding, her deep understanding, and her choice of wording when talking about the exploitation that the countries of the West have done of the countries of the East, how Britain thrives on exploiting not only the nations but also the people of countries that they colonized. But overall, I would have liked for better polishing of the novel, more subtlety, and overall, I felt like some areas of the book were just lacking. But maybe in a different world, another draft, another round of editing would have definitely solved those issues. But don't let this review discourage you from reading Babel. I would definitely say check it out and develop your opinions on your own. These were just my opinions. If you liked watching this video, make sure to subscribe. I am not very regular in posting videos, but I am trying my best. Thank you for watching. Be safe during this pandemic. If you like this video, make sure to like, share, subscribe. You know the drill. Leave a comment down below. Comments can be literally anything. You can just spam as well. I'm that desperate for comments. So that was it. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.